Thank you very much. We're entering the practical phase of the conference now, so I'll leave the politics to the experts and move on to the spade side of things. I spend all my time on farm advising on how to obviously make more profit for each individual business, and that varies from farm to farm. But what I thought would be valuable at the moment is the areas that you may not have thought about, which are actually relatively easy to adapt and just alter the thinking pattern so that you're enhancing the resources on your own farm to the maximum efficiency that you can. So the first thing, this is a picture of Rob Richmond's, one of his cows. He's here today. You may think that this is just a pretty cow grazing a pretty forage herbal lay, but what I want to explain to you is how to be thinking of your lays and your swards in terms of volume rather than area. So we're always talking about grazing so many acres of land, so many hectares or whatever, and we're thinking of grass production and crop production in those terms. But what I think we need to do is start looking at countries which have had the financial pressures laid on them in the past, Australia, the Midwest of America, and start seeing how they're thinking and how we can adopt those things in the UK. I'm always talking about the whole cycle of nutrition on a farm. I started off doing typical ruminant nutrition science, animal production science, did my Nuffield coming up to 20 years ago now, where largely in Australia I learned that you should be looking at the soil as the key to the efficient production, the disease resistance, and the whole financial cycle of the farm. I've been doing a lot of work with Slurry, which I'll talk about today, and that is another area where we're missing a whole resource and we're not utilising it to the greatest advantage. So always be thinking in circles. I'm sure most of you are, but everything that you put on the ground is incredibly valuable, and always remember it's difficult to take off. If you feed a cow something and you decide it's the wrong thing, you can remove it from the animal's feed relatively easily. If you put the wrong product on the ground, thinking that you're creating an enhanced, say you're putting calcium lime on the ground and you're thinking that you need to lime that soil, but you put the wrong thing down, you're going to pay for that for 10 years and you can't easily take it off again. So it's worth thinking about what you're doing with the soil and getting that bit right, because it can financially make all the difference. Thinking of analogies, think of the soil as a bathroom sponge. I think that's the easiest analogy. That together with a children's game of magnets. Those are the two things that I think about. So you need a very aerobic and a very moist bathroom sponge. So 25% air, 25% moisture in your top, say we're talking about the top foot of soil, for those who are still in inches. We're looking for the physical crumb structure so that we don't want a great slab of clay and we don't want a completely loose sand. I'm working with soils that have got virtually no structure to them, very flinty, difficult soils in Dorset, very solid, flooded soils on the Somerset levels. And I've been really pleased in the sort of dearth of everything being a bit depressing recently, just getting a bit low. This last week, 4 farmers have telephoned me who I haven't really spoken to in the last couple of years, to say how what we've done on the soil has revolutionised the profitability of their farm. And one of them was a really young chap on a council farm, and I was really worried that he would survive this financial pressure that we're under at the moment. And to me, that's the reward of the job. People normally phone up to complain. If they phone up just to tell you that things are going well, you know you're on the right track. I'll be talking about bacterial health in the soil. There's a lot to do with complex soil food webs. I won't be going into that, just the balance between bacteria and fungi, how you need to look for aerobic bacteria and healthy soil fungi. That is the way to be looking. And the mineral balance of the soil, which Will Armitage will touch on as well in his presentation shortly. Just remember, I'll just flick through this for speed, the cow is criticised sometimes for producing too much methane in terms of the carbon cycle. On the organic side, I always favour organic agriculture in a fairly lightweight way, because I think it's good in terms of the ethos and good environmentally, and the health of the food product at the end of the day far outweighs the food product of a conventional farming system. But until I heard a medical doctor speaking at Holme Lacey at one of the conferences there, I hadn't really taken on board how strongly valuable the organic food movement is going to be in the future. And he was saying that we will reach a critical point in the human population where the children of the generation will start dying before their parents because of the influence of synthetically produced food, and how valuable organic food production will increasingly become over the next 100 years. And nitrous oxide is contributing hugely to the carbon problem, and methane is relatively little. As you can see here, 24 carbon dioxide relative to 297. And when I go on to these technical panels and get asked questions about how to improve the carbon footprint, the one thing I'm going to talk about today, which is the enhanced slurry utilisation, is the one thing that Arla wheeled out and presented to all their dairy farmers in the whole country over a 2-year programme, purely on one sentence that I said in a conference, which I had thought maybe wasn't that important. But my understanding of carbon footprint is relatively shallow. But I have to tell you that the understanding on these panels is relatively shallow as well. And if you can just reduce your nitrogen wastage by 10% on a farm, you can make a huge impact on the profitability and the nutrient resources there. So moving on, I won't dwell on the carbon cycle, but what I'm aiming to do is use slurry efficiently and keep that soil covered with some kind of crop, no bare stubble, and also minimum ploughing. And people are thinking organically that you can't get away with minimal ploughing, but I'm working more and more on minimum till and zero till in the organic situation, and using stale seed beds and undersowing techniques to try to reduce ploughing as much as possible. So in terms of the carbon cycle, enhancing green cover and enhancing efficient utilisation of slurry. So soil fertility, building crops, green manures, it's becoming increasingly popular, and I can give you more information on this if you want to discuss it at another time. But don't look at conventional seed ryegrasses and so forth, and especially Italians, that are designed to work on fertiliser systems of the past. Look at things that can utilise the soil and the soil to different depths. So you need to look at plants that are producing leafy carbon type of product, but also, in terms of my previous comment of thinking of soil volume, you need plants that are going to suck the nutrients out of the soil. Phosphorus is a big deal with regards to organic farming, very difficult to build levels if you've got a low phosphate base with the farm. Usually it's available phosphate that's the problem, not the total phosphate. So you need to release phosphate with organic microbial activity. And the more lignin you have, as this diagram shows, the higher the humus level in the soil, the greater the release of phosphate. Most farms are not short of raw material phosphorus. They're short of available phosphate, and that's where the whole soil microbiology kicks in again. Nitrogen cycle, again, many of you are familiar with that, but we want the soil to be a working, living soil, not a dead soil. And you can have a turnover of 4 tons of topsoil a year with a healthy earthworm population. And that's a huge resource. Many of us don't even know the life cycle of earthworms well. And I've just had to give a training course recently to a load of FWAG advisors. And the knowledge of our earthworm science is relatively poor. And if you look on Amazon, actually, for second-hand books, still the publication to source is Charles Darwin's Earthworm and the Humus textbook. And you can still get copies on Amazon, and they're not expensive unless you want an original first copy. But Charles Darwin spent something like 40 years studying earthworms, and by the end of his career recognized that it was probably the most essential species on Earth to recycling food and feeding the human population and keeping health in the food products. Moving on to the slurries. This is just a typical slurry lagoon situation, because obviously separated slurries and different handling systems become more complex. But there has been a lot of research going on in Australia, and I always look to the Australians for the minimum bullshit, excuse my language, for using products that pay, that are not commercially hyped up, and that actually work in the practical situation. This is a trial. We trialed about 9 different products. This happens to be the trial work on one through a company called BioAg, but this is a solution product. You can get powdered products. You don't need to pay too much for these products, and they're becoming better and better. I started looking at these 10 years ago when a lot of them didn't work very well. Now they're working well. So this is a solution product that's tipped into a typical mixed slurry lagoon, and this will work on straw-based cubicles, a lot of straw in there, even farmyard manure to some degree, right the way through to sand-based cubicle slurry. So the carbon-nitrogen balance of the slurry will obviously vary according to the bedding, but this sort of treatment will work to greater or lesser extent on any type of slurry. So you put the product in and just leave it to work. You don't have to stir it because the depth of the slurry, if you've got 2 meters or more, that is an advantage because you get a convection current building with the microbes in the slurry lagoon. But it will start eating the slurry away, and if you look at the edge of this picture, you'll see bubbles starting to come. And I've become quite sad, really, gazing on cold winter mornings in the pouring rain at various slurry lagoons to see if I can watch the bubbling pattern and learn how these bugs are working. But this one's more obvious. You can see bubbles in the lagoon, and it looks as though you're keeping carp or something in the slurry lagoon because these bubbles become quite large and they become more and more regular in the pattern. And if you start looking at the lagoon every week and just gaze at it while you're thinking about something else for half an hour or so and watch the pattern of the bubbles, you start learning how the bubbles develop and how the microbes are telling you what they're doing with your slurry. So you'll get a whole mass of little bubbles. Then all of a sudden, any straw crust will be miraculously digested away, usually within about a week. All of a sudden, the whole thing will go clear, and you start getting this effect. And the surface becomes a lot more liquid, and the whole thing increases in digestion. If you can do 3 or 4 months through the winter, it pays off to the best benefit. This is the type of thing that you're getting, which is a practical thing, but also saving money and affecting carbon footprint, which I hadn't particularly thought of because I'm not so much of a contractor. But in terms of stirring the lagoons and getting rid of any crust, this particular farm on one of the trial farms said it was only taking 4 hours to digest, to stir the slurry rather than 12, therefore using less diesel, therefore saving time, saving contractor money. They could use the umbilical system more effectively, so reducing soil compaction and getting a better spread. And there was no smell and no dead earthworms. So in terms of being practical, a lot of the time contractors want to whack as much slurry on the ground as possible to make everything as cost effective and time effective as possible. If you do that with normal untreated slurry, you will kill a whole load of earthworms, and you've all seen the negative side of that, I'm sure. If you have a treated slurry, I wouldn't necessarily advocate that it's the best practice, but you have a much greater margin for error because the slurry is no longer going to be sucking oxygen out of the soil. It's already been through that process, it's already done its thing, and it's now effectively a composted slurry. How does that benefit the microbes? Talking about biological oxygen demand, I just said slurry is sucking the air out of the soil and actually suffocates the earthworms rather than drowning them because it's sucking the oxygen with its reactivity. If you just skip a load of the figures on here, but just look at the bottom figures, the aerobic microbes are the thing that makes the difference in the slurry. So the start slurry has got 4 million or so aerobic microbes in it. The control slurry sitting in the lagoon for 3 or 4 months then moves up to, say, 7.5 million. But as soon as you've treated it with one of these biotreatments, you've got 32, nearly 33 million count of aerobic bacteria. So the slurry is now a lot more aerobic than it was in the beginning. And I'll move on now to the benefits of the nitrogen and the other nutrients. I was criticising the trial data because it's quite nice for me to have something new that I hadn't realised. And this American old advisor was saying to me, just think about the data, because I thought that the methodology we were using through the laboratory was wrong, that we could not be getting higher nitrogens at the end of this 3 or 4 month period than we were at the beginning. Because everyone's always saying how you're losing nitrogen from the slurry and it's volatilizing off and you should be covering lagoons and all these other extra expenses. So how is it that you're getting higher nitrogen at the end of the trial than you were at the beginning? And what I hadn't figured was that the bacterial activity in the lagoon is so strong that those bugs are actually nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they're fixing atmospheric nitrogen into the slurry material. So the average figure, the benefit of the NPK of the slurry at the end of treating would be about 30% more than it was at the beginning. Now that makes a big difference conventionally, and it makes an even bigger difference organically, because nitrogen is always one of the limiting factors. So if you combine a treated slurry with 30% more nitrogen, which no longer is tainted and does not smell, it does not affect the palatability of the grazing of the cattle. If you put slurry, even in the autumn, on the grazing that the cattle are supposed to be grazing next spring, we all know that there is some residual taint there. I've worked with farms now for 5 or 6 years on treating this slurry, and I've had ongoing enhanced palatability of the grazing, not having to apply any salt or anything like that, just with the actual biology of the soil, I presume enhancing the smell of the soil and digesting the slurry and not putting raw material, effective sewage slurry on the ground, but putting the treated slurry on the ground. Then you combine it with herbal lays, which we'll hear a bit more about in a minute as well. Newman Turner, these old textbooks that are very interesting to read, always said that herbal lays were incorporating the fertilizer merchant, the food manufacturer, and the vet all in one. So you're getting a medicinal benefit as well as a nutrient profile benefit from a herbal lay. So using a wide range of plant species, this is where I was coming into using the volume of the soil rather than the area of the land. So instead of just exploiting your top 4 inches with a typical ryegrass or even a ryegrass and a single clover, start looking at different clovers. So maybe use 3 reds or 3 white varieties or mixture if you want to. Speak to people who are good at the herbal lays in the seed world according to where you are geographically. Cotswold seeds are obviously very good if you're in the Cotswolds or on dry brash soil. Other people up in Hereford are very good if you're looking at a more loamy soil. You need to have an expertise on which plants to put in a herbal lay on your soil type so that you don't get dominated out by a certain species, like chicory, for example, will just go rife on some soil types and dominate the whole herbal lay, and it's an absolute nightmare to control it. You need to have a bit of experience and expertise on which mixture balance to put in. And just try it on 1 or 2 fields to start with, and then you can get a feel for how to utilize it. And if any of you are in a drought situation, it's the most fantastic get out for drought type farms. But you're using the volume of the soil, and if you fertilize this with a treated slurry, you're having a win-win situation. And any of you who are struggling for dry matter production, the figures being quoted for a use of 3 species of plant or more on a herbal lay are up to a 50% increase in dry matter production of that sward. So financially, I'm working on many organic farms where their dry matter production of forage has become increasingly limited over the time that they've been organic. And as well as looking at the soil type, I'm now looking very much at slurry treatment and utilising these different plant species to recover soil structure and soil microbiology and the organic matter. What I always say is get a spade and dig. Have an affinity with your soil, dig a hole in each field every month, that sort of amount. Just get a feel for how that particular field varies on the weather conditions, whether you've got surface compaction, deep layer compaction, whether you can get away without ploughing it, whether you can do minimum till or just use some kind of surface sumo cultivator so that you're doing a stale seed bed. But think in a flexible way. Don't think that you always have to plough, because ploughing is very destructive to the soil microbes in the top layers of the soil. And my advice would be, whenever you can avoid ploughing, avoid it. Smell the soil. Think of it like really like a silage. When I first started doing this, I felt very weird looking at the soils, thinking, oh, this seems a bit bizarre. But actually, the cheapest soil test is the smell of the soil. And this Australian lady that I work with, Pat Colby, she said, always trust your nose. You don't just smell things for the sake of it. You're geared over, historic time to be able to recognize things by the smell of them. If that slurry smells dreadful, that slurry is dreadful. If that slurry doesn't smell of anything too bad, it's not too bad. If a compost heap smells really lovely, of like garden compost, it's very good. And it's the cheapest lab test because you don't have to pay anyone. Earthworms, look at the colour, look at the activity of them, put them on your hand and see how cross they get. I have this a lot because I'm talking to a bunch of farmers. I dig some worms up and I have a look at them and I'm busy talking, and the earthworms are getting impatient on my hand and they don't like the feel of the temperature, the warmth of your hand. And the one that you can see in the picture diving off, they will soon do that, and that's a very clear indication of how healthy they are. If you put a whole load of unpleasant slurry on top of that worm, it will move and get out of the way, particularly if you use a dribble bar or trailing shoe and try and avoid the splash plate system. So those earthworms can tell you an awful lot And again, you can see them. The great thing with earthworms is that they're visible. All these microbes are all well and good, and you might be able to smell them, in terms of the health of the soil, but you don't have to get an analysis to see how good your earthworms are. And you want about 25 earthworms per cubic spade, per cubic foot of soil. And that will give you a living soil, different sized earthworms. If you, I observed this over time, if you apply a heavy dose of slurry and you kill out a population of earthworms, and then you dig your holes and look at them 6 months later, your earthworms will all be the same size because you've knocked out a population. If you have earthworms as thick as your finger, right the way down to the little small, thin baby earthworms, then you know that you're enhancing the whole population and the whole thing's moving. In summary, again, think about balancing your soil minerals up according to using different products. Don't think because you're organic that you can't use natural fertilizers. You need to be using them, and you need to be getting the cost-effective benefit from them. So if, for example, you're short of calcium, despite your pH being all right, your sulfate may already be low. That won't help your nitrogen utilization. You've got to have the right balance of sulfur in the soil. Look at products like gypsum. People have miraculously good effects with using gypsum. And it's not necessarily that expensive. It can be very cost effective at certain times of the year. The best time to spread natural gypsum is in the summer when it's dry, because spreading a wet product can be a practical nightmare. But it's a very useful thing, and calcium is the key to all production. Kieserite, magnesium sulfate, very useful on the lighter soils. Sylvanite, natural potash with salt, and more recently polysulfate, which is a new granular product come from Cleveland Potash. You must look at sulfur levels. If you're doing basic soil analysis, just get the sulfur added on and don't run low on sulfur. You must make sure that your nitrogen is being fixed into protein, and you need sulfur to do that efficiently. So just look beyond this typical NPK soil analysis. And just in summary, promote the benefits of the living resources on your farm. So you've got slurry there already, you've got soil there already, you've got air, you've got nitrogen in the air. Make the whole nitrogen cycle work for you and get the maximum benefit out of it that you can. Get this forage quality up, get the mineral balance in the forages right. And I'm still interested in TB disease resistance relative to the soil, I think is a big player. And farms where I've been working a long time, where the soils are really very healthy, I would say, I'm really pleased with the soils. The TB incidence is definitely less than soils where you've got stagnant, compacted, horrible anaerobic reservoirs of disease, I would say, unhealthy soils. Get this efficient feed conversion going, have a look at the feed in and the productivity out, and see if you've got this black hole happening, which happens on many farms where things are disappearing into nothing. And just exploit these beneficial relationships as far as you can, and financially, I think you'll find it pays dividends.
Thank you very much, Jo.